General Hospital will reveal. 1. Willow and Michael's reunion is sabotaged by Drew. Willow had tried to build a peaceful life with Drew after months of unbearable heartache. To her, Drew was the only one who stayed, the one who held her hand when it felt like no one else was there. They went through aimless days together after Michael's sudden disappearance, which left a deep wound in Willow's heart, one she tried to mend over and over, yet never truly healed. She chose to believe Michael had abandoned her. That his final words, cold and distant, were the painful truth she had no choice but to accept. She tried to forget. She had to forget. No one can live forever in the past, especially when that past is filled with unanswered questions. But then, on a cold afternoon in Germany, while Willow and Drew were visiting a local medical center, she caught sight of a familiar figure walking down the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat, as if her instincts had recognized something her mind could not accept. He looked exactly like Michael. That hair, that stride, those eyes, it was as if time itself had shattered. Willow froze. Drew noticed the shift in her expression immediately, turning to see what she was seeing. There he was, Michael, alive and well, staring back at them. Time stood still as the three locked eyes, a reunion that none of them were prepared for, overflowing with shock and emotion. Michael, long presumed dead or at least lost, was now standing before them, as real as ever. But something had changed. His eyes were filled with pain, confusion, and a fog of emotion that words couldn't describe. He stepped closer, trembling, unsure if this was a dream or reality. Willow couldn't hold back her tears. Drew stepped in between them. His face tense, his stance guarded. He knew this moment would change everything. Willow was still the woman he loved, the one he thought he might build a future with. But Michael's return was the wound their fragile relationship couldn't survive. Willow was overwhelmed by a storm of emotions. She tried to find an explanation, but the truth stunned her more than anything. Michael hadn't left her willingly. He never wanted to push her away. The man who had rejected her at the Baden-Baden burn clinic, the man who had been cold, harsh, and dismissive, was not the real Michael. It was Drew. Somehow, in a twisted scheme, Drew had orchestrated everything so that Willow believed Michael had changed and no longer loved her. And worst of all, she had believed it. A tidal wave of betrayal crushed Willow. She felt like a pawn in the hands of the man she thought had saved her. She returned to her room, trembling, staring at herself in the mirror. Unable to answer the only question that mattered, how had she been so blind? Meanwhile, Michael was still reeling from what he had just learned. He couldn't fathom how Drew had taken his place. How he had stood in front of Willow, the woman Michael loved more than anything, and built a relationship on deception. Port Charles had seen many returns from the dead and shocking twists. But this story wasn't just about a man coming back. It was about an unavoidable confrontation between two men in love with the same woman. Drew, the one who had lifted Willow from despair, now found himself standing in the way of her true happiness. Michael was no longer the man he once was. His staged death, his disappearance, and his shattered memories had changed him. But one thing had never changed, his love for Willow. She was his anchor in the darkest of times. And now, standing between two men, Willow realized that no matter what she chose, someone's heart would be broken. Drew wasn't ready to lose her. He refused to believe that Michael, after everything, could just come back and win her over with a few words. He began to interfere, blocking their time together, raising barriers using excuses about her medical condition and emotional health. But every time he saw her in pain, he began to understand that love, even when built on care and gratitude, could never replace the passion of a bond forged in truth. The dynamic between the three quickly grew as tense as a taut wire ready to snap. Willow couldn't pretend that nothing had happened, yet she also couldn't deny the deep stirrings in her heart every time she saw Michael. the more Drew tried to hold on to her. The further she drifted away, caught in a storm only she could navigate. One night, she stood alone on the balcony of her apartment in Port Charles. The very place she and Michael had once spent countless hours together. And for the first time in months, she cried, not from grief, but because she realized that true love never dies. It only sleeps, waiting to awaken, sweeping away every lie in its path. 2. Brad Cooper and Marco Rio meeting. Everything between Lucas and Marco seemed to be going too perfectly, too smoothly to be real in a town as chaotic as Port Charles. Marco brought a sense of stability, trust, and hope into Lucas's life, something he never thought he would feel again after the heartbreak with Brad. But the truth has a way of interrupting even the most peaceful chapters. Lucas began to sense inconsistencies in Marco's stories, particularly regarding his connection to Lucas's father, Jen Sidwell. Details didn't match, timelines were vague. And gaps in Marco's recollections became harder to ignore. Then, Lucas stumbled upon an old photo, one that clearly showed Marco working closely with Jens on a controversial project Lucas had long opposed. Everything began to unravel. The confrontation was inevitable. Feeling betrayed and blindsided, Lucas demanded the truth. Cornered and emotionally overwhelmed, Marco confessed to having a complicated past with Jens but admitted he had kept it from Lucas out of fear of losing him. Lucas, devastated, felt like history was repeating itself, another web of lies. Another broken foundation. The arguments were heated, raw, and full of old wounds being reopened. Unable to process the pain, Marco stormed out, and Lucas was left in silence. Surrounded by the shards of what had felt like a promising new beginning. That night, Marco found himself at a small bar on the south side of town, drowning his regret in whiskey and solitude. There, he struck up a conversation with a charming Asian man whose wit and self-deprecating humor pulled Marco briefly out of his despair, Brad. They drank together. Swapped vague stories about exes and heartbreak without naming names, and bonded over mutual disillusionment with love. One drink led to another, and by the end of the night, they fell into bed together, both needing an escape. It wasn't until the next morning, when Marco groggily opened his eyes and saw a framed photo on the nightstand, Lucas and Brad together in happier times, that the crushing realization hit. The man he had just slept with was none other than Lucas's ex-husband. The fallout was swift and merciless. Lucas had spent the night alone, replaying every conversation. Every red flag he'd ignored with Marco. He was preparing to call it off completely when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Attached was a photo, grainy, clearly taken in haste. But unmistakable. It showed Marco leaving the Harborview Inn early that morning, with Brad. Lucas's blood turned to ice. He stared at the screen, his mind racing to make sense of it, but deep down, he already knew. Betrayal had a bitter taste, and this time it came from both the man he had been learning to trust and the man who had already broken his heart once before. When Marco returned to Lucas's apartment later that day, hoping to explain everything, he was met with a wall of silence and restrained fury. Lucas didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He simply looked at Marco and asked, "Did you know who he was?" Marco hesitated, and in that hesitation, Lucas found his answer. Marco tried to explain that he had no idea Brad was his ex-husband until the next morning, that it was a drunken mistake made in grief and confusion. But Lucas wasn't interested in apologies born from regret. To him, it wasn't just about the one night, it was about trust, and the growing sense that no matter how far he ran from the past, it always seemed to find him. Brad, meanwhile, was equally shaken. He had no idea Marco was dating Lucas, and the moment he realized the connection, a mixture of guilt and dread washed over him. For once, he hadn't been scheming or manipulative. It had been a genuine moment of vulnerability, a rare night where he hadn't felt like the villain. But now, he found himself once again in the middle of chaos he never intended to create. He debated whether to reach out, to apologize, to explain. But part of him knew that for Lucas, his involvement, intentional or not, was just another wound in a heart already stitched together too many times. Lucas didn't speak to either of them for days. He needed time, not just to decide what to do, but to remember who he was when he wasn't defined by betrayal. He walked the waterfront at night, revisiting memories of his past with Brad, replaying laughter that had turned to tears. He also thought about Marco, how close he'd come to trusting again, to believing that maybe love could still be something simple, something pure. But now, everything was stained. In the end, Lucas stood in front of the mirror and told himself a truth that had taken years to accept: he didn't need to forgive them to move on. He didn't need closure. What he needed was peace. And peace, at least for now, meant walking away from both Brad and Marco, not in anger, but in self-preservation. Because love, no matter how passionately it begins, cannot thrive in shadows and silence. And Lucas, for the first time in a long time, was ready to choose himself. 3. Love blossoms between Anna Devane and Henry Hank Dalton. Anna had always trusted her instincts. They had kept her alive through years of espionage, heartbreak, and political entanglements. But something about Henry Hank Dalton disarmed her, if only for a moment. Their meeting at the Savoy on April 29 had started off as casual and unassuming. A mere collision between two strangers in the soft jazz and low lighting of Port Charles's most elegant venue. But the charm of the handsome PCU professor, paired with a sly wit and piercing gaze, lingered with Anna longer than she expected. She had walked away that night with a cool poise, refusing to give him her number, certain that if fate had something to say, Port Charles would take care of the rest. And fate, indeed, was not done. Their paths crossed again only a few days later, not at a cocktail lounge, but in the most unlikely of places. The PCU campus. Anna had come to visit Emma, her granddaughter, under the pretense of checking in on her courses. But when she turned a corner near the university's library and nearly bumped straight into Dalton, the moment froze in time. There was surprise, laughter, and something heavier that passed between them, a current that could not be ignored. Dalton seized the opportunity this time, gently asking if she would join him for coffee. Anna hesitated. Something about him was magnetic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something behind that polished academic exterior. Still, curiosity won over caution. What began as coffee turned into a long walk through the university gardens, and before either realized it, they had spent the entire afternoon talking about art, politics, and a surprising shared love for obscure 1960s spy novels. For the first time in years, Anna felt like a woman, not a cop, not an agent. Not a widow haunted by past ghosts, but a woman rediscovering what it meant to be seen. That night, when he leaned in to kiss her, she didn't pull away. Nor did she stop him when he invited her to his apartment overlooking the harbor. For once, she allowed herself to surrender. But Port Charles is never kind to those who let their guard down. Unbeknownst to Anna, Jocelyn and Emma had already started their own quiet investigation into Dalton. His lectures were brilliant, but there were oddities. Occasional encrypted files on his university server, a few visiting faculty badges from agencies that didn't officially exist, and one email from a defunct WSB domain address. Jocelyn had flagged it all, but hadn't told Anna yet. She wasn't sure how to bring it up, not without sounding paranoid. But the pieces were starting to form a pattern. Emma, too, had noticed how Dalton often changed the subject when asked about his past. Together, the two young agents in training realized they might be dealing with someone far more dangerous than a flirty professor. By the time Anna woke up in Dalton's bed the next morning, blissfully unaware of what her granddaughter and Jocelyn were uncovering, the truth had already begun to unravel. On the table in his apartment, hidden beneath a stack of academic journals, was a small black notebook, leather-bound, hand-stitched. Inside were names, coordinates, dates, and photos. One of them was Anna, taken years ago in Istanbul. Another was Jason Morgan. And another, chillingly recent, was of Jocelyn, leaving her dorm. Anna, still half-dressed and sipping coffee from his kitchen, felt a sudden chill as she turned back toward Dalton's bedroom. The man she had just given herself to wasn't just a charming scholar. He was something else entirely. And worse, he had eyes on the very people she loved most. Anna placed the coffee cup down on the kitchen counter, her senses suddenly sharpened like a blade pulled from a sheath. That unease that had first flickered inside her at the Savoy was no longer a whisper, it was screaming. Moving through Dalton's apartment with the fluid silence of someone trained to disappear in war zones and reappear behind enemy lines, she scanned the room with precision. Her eyes landed on the partially covered black notebook again. She had no idea what made her reach for it, instinct, perhaps, or something darker, deeper, more primal. The part of her that had lost too much to ever again ignore a gut feeling. She opened it, hands steady despite the cold rush in her chest. The names leapt off the page. Recognizable WSB field agents. Some dead, some very much alive and active. Familiar locations from old operations, some tied directly to missions she had led. Her own face stared back at her from a photograph dated 3 years earlier. The Istanbul file. How the hell did Dalton get this? Then came the second photo, Jason. From a surveillance angle she knew all too well, a professional shot, not something a civilian could have obtained. And the third. Jocelyn. Caught leaving her dorm, unaware she was being watched. The date? Just 4 days ago. Anna's stomach turned to ice. She shut the notebook and walked slowly back toward the bedroom. Dalton was still asleep, the sheet draped carelessly over his hip. His face was peaceful, but Anna's mind was a storm of calculations. She picked up his phone from the nightstand and, unsurprisingly, found it locked. But she didn't need it. She already knew. He wasn't just some eccentric professor with a taste for romantic espionage novels. He was embedded. Embedded deep. She stood there for a moment, silently hating herself for letting her guard down. For choosing comfort over caution, for letting loneliness speak louder than logic. Her hands clenched. She had made love to a man who had her under surveillance. Who had her granddaughter under surveillance. Who had entered Port Charles not by chance, but by design. Dalton stirred, eyelids fluttering open. When he saw her standing there, fully dressed now. His black notebook in her hand, something in his eyes changed. The facade cracked. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. A man caught, yes, but also assessing. Assessing his next move. Her reaction, the terrain between them now littered with emotional wreckage and professional danger.